would some of us be listening to? Pop, rock, jazz, rap? Well, some of us probably listen to that otherwise. However, this is a genre that certainly has a very dedicated and a very fierce fan base, one that's worldwide. And based around that, there have been tons of influential bands that have been absolutely paramount in building this culture and shaping this phenomenon that has been known as heavy metal. So it's time to count down a couple of those most influential band or bands to the heavy metal genre. Now notice I say band or bands, considering a couple of these numbers are going to have multiple groups that are attached to them. And there will be an explanation as to why that is whenever we get there. Now, just as a generalized disclaimer, this is a list that is very much subjective. It's my list. It's a list that I've compiled. You may not feel the exact same way. So what I would like for you to do in the comments below is I want to see your top 10 list of most influential heavy metal band or bands, as well as also telling me who you think will be considered among these ranks in 10 to 20 years. So what band that is around today, or maybe just getting started today, that you feel is going to be one of the most influential groups to heavy metal 20 years down the line. So let's get started with this list, and let's start it with number 10. Number 10 is Mayhem. Originally, I thought about just putting the entirety of the first wave of black metal on here, considering all of the media attention around the church burnings and the overall culture that was perpetuated by it. But then whenever I rethought everything, Mayhem is really the group that seems to be at the center point of all of this, whenever you consider some of its exclusive membership, and then whenever you consider a lot of the events, the murders and the suicides that took place within this group's ranks. Not to mention, whenever you consider some of their earliest works are considered to be absolute godly in the ranks of not only black metal purists, but also this is something that has transitioned over into just basic heavy metal lore, that some of Mayhem's earliest works are key releases that need to be not only explored, but listened to multiple times. I include them on this list for two reasons. First of all, based around all of that history, but secondly, whenever you consider their most recent releases, which are going in a little bit more of an esoteric direction that's involving a little more experimentation, I could definitely see Mayhem influencing a brand new generation of black metal here in the 2010s. Number 9 is Meshuggah. Now, this is a band that probably a couple of years ago wouldn't be on this list. And then Gent happened, and now Meshuggah definitely needs to be characterized. Meshuggah is a group that I think is on this list primarily based around the idea of experimentation and the fact that they were able to take a sound and give it a little bit more of a technical or just a very strange tone to it, something that definitely sets them apart from a lot of the other groups of the traditional heavy metal universe. And it was something that not only took off, but ended up influencing a bunch of groups during the latter portions of the 2000s. The Gent movement isn't necessarily just attributed to Meshuggah. However, the Gent sound by itself has been basically attributed to Meshuggah, stating that it was one of the noises that were heard in a lot of their music that actually caused the Gent movement to sort of take shape and take hold. Based around all of this, and based around Meshuggah's generalized ability to just kind of give us a product that's not like anything else that you hear, makes them an extremely influential group based around what they're doing for heavy metal today. This is a group that perhaps isn't as influential as those from the 80s or the 70s. However, this is a group that I feel is definitely breaking some boundaries, or at least helping for some of those to be broken here in 2015. Number 8 is Pantera. Like it or not, Pantera is influential. This is a group that in the 1990s revolutionized really the idea of putting aggressive music to really good groove and fantastic riffage in order to really create a very aggressive and almost hostile environment. No, not hostile like death or black metal, but whenever it came to the traditional heavy metal mainstream, that was looking for a group similar to a Metallica to kind of take them into the unknown 90s, Pantera sort of did that. Considering they had one album that went to #1 on the Billboard charts, well, that's not the main reason why they're influential, but it's a hell of an accomplishment. It definitely showed that there was still a very large market for heavy metal music that just sort of wasn't being satisfied. Many people said that, grunge metal is what, or grunge rather, is what killed metal, but in reality, whenever you consider some of the output of the early 90s, metal kind of killed itself a little bit. However, Pantera definitely was able to keep metal going throughout the 1990s, and as a result influenced a ton of groups, whether it be in the metalcore department, whether it be in the hardcore department, or whether it just be in the thrash metal department. Consider groups such as Lamb of God, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of the heavy metal and heavy music that you hear in the 2000s and the 2010s definitely have a debt to pay to Pantera. And that is something that will only continue to foster itself and will continue to grow if all the meme wars that are out there don't try to kill it. Please don't. This is a style of music, this is a groove-centered idea with big riffs that should definitely encourage a lot more people to come toward heavy metal than take them away from it. Number 7, we have Napalm Death and Carcass. The first of our multi-band groups takes us all the way back to the 1980s. It takes us all the way back to the earliest foundations of grindcore, and taking the idea of punk and mixing it with very, very aggressive heavy metal with short songs and just ridiculous musicality. And you could honestly put other groups into this list and still be A-okay. Other groups such as Extreme Noise Terror were able to do this as well. However, Napalm Death is a group that's been going strong now for, well, just about 30 years. The same could actually be said for Carcass, although they were not a band for quite some time, but now they're back. Both of these groups are extremely instrumental and influential in heavy metal's development because Napalm Death has sort of stayed true throughout the entirety of their career, whereas Carcass in the first part of the 1990s took a little bit more of a melodic death metal, or even some could say a groove metal direction with their sound, which paralleled them to groups such as At the Gates. And this was actually a really nice spearhead for the entire melodic death metal or Gothenburg movement. It's one that actually helped to gain a lot of traction with bands such as Dark Tranquillity and In Flames really coming through the fold and maybe influencing even the depths of Soilwork, while still also being extremely huge in grindcore and the development of the extreme metal scene. Consider bands such as Aborted whenever you think about that. These two groups are definitely granddaddies of the grindcore and that whole side of extreme metal's development. And we are very thankful for that, considering the number of bands that we probably now listen to that would not be here without these two granddaddies. Number 6, we have Death. Probably one of the greatest pioneering bands of all time was not one that was around in the late 60s or early 70s. With the idea of death metal, which was already being suggested, toyed around with, and even executed in some portions of the world, Death was a group that right here in America was able to take it to new heights along with some other groups in the Florida death metal scene. However, Death was a group that was able to kind of give them a champion, to give death metal a champion as this bludgeoning extreme metal movement was starting to take shape and take some legs. Just the absolute uniquity to this style of music that was really presented definitely gave it sort of that vibe of the thrash metal that was very popular at the time, while also giving it an even more extreme, a more accelerated, a more just ridiculous edge. And wouldn't you know it that here 30 years later, death metal is still one of the more popular subsections of heavy metal. Death, along with other groups such as Morbid Angel and Deicide and Obituary, were really able to captivate this whole movement right here in America while also influencing tons of groups abroad. Death metal may have eventually taken shape, however, it may not have reached its sadistic limits if it wasn't for a group such as Death. And you could definitely, even if you wanted to, it's kind of optional, throw Cannibal Corpse up there too. Considering Cannibal Corpse has actually turned themselves into a little bit more of a, I guess, accessible death metal band, is that really even possible to say? Well, maybe it's the fact that their stuff shouldn't be accessible that actually makes them kind of alluring to individuals, and it's actually caused the influence there. Another thing that Death did that has certainly affected death metal in a way that you would never imagine is right at the near end of their career, they decided to start experimenting with progressive and with other different types of infusions into their very own sound, which opened the gates for more radical and strange versions of death metal to materialize. A lot of those that we're seeing today. Number 5, we have the big four of thrash metal. Yeah, 4 bands in one, but they are all extremely important. Thrash metal was influenced by some of the groups that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but they themselves have really been the cardinal influences for a lot of other groups later on. And it's not all necessarily been with thrash metal. However, thrash metal in the 1980s elevated heavy metal along with the new wave of British heavy metal to new heights, and this coupling effect actually caused metal to really experience a great period of growth throughout that decade. With the big four, there were a lot of metalheads that now had champions that they knew that they could listen to the albums, listen to the music, and just absolutely adore it. And it's something that, even though there have been some bumps in the road going down the line from the 90s into the 2000s, these are still the groups that influence and really morph and cause bands to be created. A lot of the groups that don't even go into the thrash metal department, whether they be standardized heavy metal, power metal, whether they be nu metal, whether they be alternative metal, a lot of them can trace back to at least one of these groups. And of course, most notably is probably Metallica, with second place probably going to Slayer. These two groups definitely have a premier influence whenever it comes to a lot of bands that have followed them. And because of that, that influence cannot be ignored. Number 4, Celtic Frost, Mercyful Fate, and Venom. This is the dawning of extreme metal and of dark metal. Mercyful Fate and Venom were around before Celtic Frost. However, Celtic Frost took the idea that Mercyful Fate and Venom sort of started toying with and went to the extreme. With Mercyful Fate and Venom, we started to hear a lot of more sadistic, satanic, and very, very dark influences on a sound that definitely resembled the new wave of British heavy metal, or just a very darkened kind of almost gothic style. It's something that really was very unique at the time. But then Celtic Frost came around. Well, Hellhammer came first, but Celtic Frost came from it, and really transitioned that sound into something even darker, even more sinister, even more brooding, and opened the door for a just vast expansion of very gothic, very dark, very extreme, sinister, you name it. Some styles of heavy metal that would perhaps just not be very willing to go into those directions if these bands were not in existence. These are the granddaddies of the grim. These are the granddaddies of also very over-the-top theatrics, and in some cases could potentially be the precursor to black metal in some regard, taking the ideas that these bands were able to perpetuate and go even further and even more grim, even blacker, even more sinister. But they all trace their roots back to these 3 fundamental groups, among a few others. These 3 groups, though, are the ones that are the champions of the fold, considering they were able to bring this to a mass, and they were able to really get everything circulated well. They still maintain themselves as 3 of the most influential groups, not only in heavy metal, but perhaps in music in general. Number 3, we have Budgie, we have Judas Priest, we have Led Zeppelin, and you could even throw in a group such as Diamond Head. Hell, you could even throw in the Misfits if you really wanted to. Remember how we said that the big 4 were influenced by some other groups? Well, here you have a couple of them. The new wave of British heavy metal movement was one of the premier influences to the big 4 even getting off of the ground. Now, granted, there are some other groups that were just playing it because of a very heavy influence on punk, but the new wave of British heavy metal is what tailored it a little bit more toward heavy metal and steered it a little bit more away from just being generalized punk. But with Budgie, Priest, Led Zeppelin, and Diamond Head and the Misfits, literally you could feel the absolute influence almost everywhere, on every block of life. This is something that was influencing rock music, heavy metal music, punk music, and even just a little bit of the traditional culture that you're going to get. And it was something that really rocked the 1980s. Judas Priest especially was able to take everything to a brand new level in the 1980s with their stage show and their real attention being paid toward detail. The high-pitched screams of Rob Halford definitely made him the air raid siren at the time that soon would face some competition. But it was something where, coupled with that other individual, heavy metal soared to new heights. And based around that, their influence could be felt, the shockwave created could be felt worldwide. It was something that brought heavy metal not only to just the countries in which these bands existed, but it brought it to the entirety of the planet Earth and made it a very important and very viable force. And for that, we are exceptionally thankful. The number of bands that these groups have really influenced or brought into being is absurd. Look them up if you don't believe me. Number 2, Black Sabbath. I know what you're thinking. I just sinned. But they're the first heavy metal band. Cover Killer Nation, they have to be number 1. Just because you're number 1, you're the first one to ever do it, doesn't mean that you're the most important or the most influential group. But Black Sabbath is very important. They're extremely important considering they helped to spur on the new wave of British heavy metal. They have definitely been principal influences in the style of doom metal. And they're still a group that today is cited as one of the most important, if not the most important groups that this genre has had ever since their inception, ever since their creation. They're the band that helped coin the term. They're the band that initially brought it to the public attention. How could they not be number 1? Well, Ozzy and the boys are definitely extremely important. The number of bands they've influenced is, again, absurd. But this is a group that also has had some struggle-filled periods where I think that influence kind of waned a little bit. Where I think that influence kind of wasn't as important to the public eye. Where you almost need a little bit more consistency in order for that to be considered number 1. It's something where perhaps they would have been number 1 up until a certain point, and then they would have gotten superseded in influence. But it's hard to say. What I will say is this: even though I have them at number 2, I would probably place number 2 and number 1 as pretty interchangeable. It's something that should be interchangeable between a lot of people. Now before we get to number 1, you may wonder, there's an absence of progressive music. Where are groups such as Yes, or Rush, or maybe even Dream Theater? While Dream Theater is important, I don't think their influence has really qualified them for this list yet. And to be perfectly fair, bands like Rush and Yes are actually a little bit more in the progressive rock department. I know we talked about, Led Zeppelin, and they're definitely more rock and roll, with just some heavy metal tendencies. But with Rush and the whole entirety of the progressive movement, that started off all as rock and actually morphed into metal as time went on. So you're not going to see anything about that yet. But in the future, definitely expect it. So that brings us to number 1, which is Iron Maiden. You might wonder what makes Iron Maiden more influential than Black Sabbath. And yeah, I understand, it's kind of a difficult thing to imagine. But Iron Maiden is a heavy metal powerhouse. This is a group that has been able to sell on upwards to 80 million copies of their albums, and the number of bands that they have influenced and brought into being is even more absurd than perhaps the past couple of numbers combined. Iron Maiden has been seen as a principal influence for the field of power metal, for standardized heavy metal, and they're one of those groups that's similar to Metallica, or even Pantera in some regards, that you're feeling this influence even in groups that don't follow the traditional formula of what Iron Maiden is all about. A band such as Cradle of Filth, which really exhibits more of a thrashy style with a darkened metal tendency with just an extreme metal exterior, is very, very big fans of Iron Maiden. In fact, they've pretty much superseded in some areas the popularity of Iron Maiden in Britain, at least whenever they have an album out, and then that immediately transitions back into Maiden, but that's not really the point. The point is that Iron Maiden's influence is something that, when coupled with a couple of the other groups on this list, are what really have created the bands that are out there today. Iron Maiden's influence is extremely important, worldly felt, and something that continues to inspire individuals even here in 2015. Their degree of influence certainly has not died. Just like the degree of influence of Jimi Hendrix, the guitar player, hasn't died here in 2015. That's still going to continue, because that's a legendary individual whose feel, and not to mention whose influence, will be felt perhaps until the end of musical time. Whenever it comes to, heavy metal, Iron Maiden is that. Their influence will be felt probably till the end of musical time. They're timeless, they're legendary, and they're a group that has worldly appeal. Well, there you have it. It was more than 10, but there's the top 10 most influential band or bands to heavy metal. Like I said in the beginning of this video, I'd like to see your top 10 list in the comments below, along with the names of groups that are around now that perhaps in 10 to 20 years we could be citing as some of the most influential bands of heavy metal. Thanks again. I'm Cover Killer Nation, and I'll talk to you later.